Okay, we are live.
We are reconvening our morning hearing and going to switch topics to PFAS and welcome our first two witnesses who are both from VPIRG.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Again, for the record, my name is Paul Burns. I'm the Executive Director of VPIRG. We have Anna introduce herself.
Everyone, Anna Suberlang, environmental advocate, also with VPIRG. Good to see you.
We'll be doing a little tag team through this testimony, and we will have about a half hour, as I understand it. Then it'll be followed by two more scientific experts on this topic. So if we can't answer a question that you may have in this first 30 minutes, pretty sure you'll be able to get an answer following. So we're really pleased to be in this position right now. VPIRG, as you know, has worked on issues of toxics and their effect or the threats that they may pose to human health and to the environment for decades. We have members across the state in each one of your legislative districts and in every other legislative district in the state. We appreciate the work of the Agency of Natural Resources in this matter and the agency's collaboration with the Department of Health and the Attorney General's office. We're grateful to say that we have significant common ground with what the agency is recommending here in terms of next steps on PFAS. And what many of us, that is true for VPIRG and many of us who work in the area of public health and the environment. Today, we'll identify that common ground and make some specific recommendations for those areas where differences remain. And our hope and belief is that important legislation can and should be passed this year that will make progress on PFAS and could potentially tee up additional consideration for legislation next year and beyond. Just as a reminder of why we're here and why we're concerned about PFAS, PFAS are sometimes referred to as forever chemicals because they're incredibly persistent in our bodies and in the environment. They're often toxic and they bioaccumulate in living organisms. This is a huge family of chemicals. I know Matt Chapman from the Department of Environmental Conservation gave a nice overview of this last week. But I'll just note that according to the National Institutes of Health, quote, epidemiological studies have revealed associations between exposure to specific PFAS and a variety of health effects, including altered immune and thyroid function, liver disease, lipid and insulin dysregulation, kidney disease, adverse reproductive and developmental outcomes, and cancer. So I'm not going to spend more time on that, but this is a serious issue, but well worthy of your consideration. What we've accomplished so far, again, Matt Chapman reviewed some of this, so I'll just note behind me here on the board, this describes the various areas where Vermont has already, as a public policy matter, said that we will remove PFAS from these categories, largely of consumer products. And thank you to you, and in some cases to your predecessors for taking this action. It's really important. So now we're moving forward and looking at future categories, product categories for action. Here again, we are in complete agreement with the agency that action can and should be taken to eliminate PFAS in dental floss, fluorinated containers, and cleaning products. We note that upholstered furniture was also part of the agency's original report, not in their proposed language. Other states, including California, Connecticut, Maine, and Minnesota, have moved forward to ban PFAS in upholstered furniture. It's an area I'm not sure I understand why that wasn't in their recommendation here, so maybe worthy of consideration as well. But at a minimum, these three product categories, we are in full support of moving forward.
Can I just, you said Connecticut, Maine, Montana, California have done upholstered?
We're in the process of implementing. So Anna,
Great.
let me turn it over to you.
Sure. The agency also proposed a change to the definition of intentionally added. And we agree with the agency's proposal here. I put the definition on the screen behind me. We believe the proposed definition really aligns with the legislative intent of the bill. If the goal of Act 131 is to make consumer products more PFAS-free, this change is a really crucial step to ensuring that PFAS added during the manufacturing process are properly accounted for and regulated. So it's possible that coatings or lubricants used in the manufacturing equipment in factories can contain PFAS, which then transfers onto products. So an example of this could be artificial turf. In 2023, the legislature banned intentionally added PFAS from artificial turf. However, during the manufacturing process, turf manufacturers use PFAS-laden lubricants, which contaminate that final product. So the original or current definition laid out in Act 131 of intentionally added allows the use of these lubricants, even though PFAS would be present in the final product. So under this newer proposal, manufacturers would no longer be allowed to use those production methods, and PFAS would be removed from the manufacturing process.
So hold on, how does we already have intentionally added in statute. How does it allow for the use of those, I'm going to say like industrial lubricant?
So the old definition,
Just the current.
sure, the current definition, thank you, says the intentionally added is defined as the chemical in a product that serves an intended function in the product component. So the PFAS used in the manufacturing process isn't necessarily intended for necessary for the product component, but it's more like a contaminant.
Thank you. I think I just thought I thought we were currently closer to the first paragraph up there than we are.
Anna, would you, the chair asked about effective dates for the restrictions passed in other states as well. I just want to note that it is in the testimony as well for when those prohibitions take effect.
Nora,
So is this a change to the current definition that's in?
this is a proposed change.
This is a proposed change. What does the current definition read?
Anna was, yeah,
Yeah, the current definition means intentionally added means the addition of a chemical in a product that serves an intended function in the product.
in the,
It's just that, that's it.
The intended function in that case might be to make it grease resistant or, any number of things. Synthetic turf, it's not performing it's not intended to make the turf itself perform better. It's just part of that manufacturing process. And then a residue, as I understand it, is on that product at the end.
So does this definition include, for example, if manufacturer uses water as part of their process, and then they find out that the water is contaminated? Does that mean they're held liable for that their water source is contaminated, and now all the products are considered contaminated? Or?
They do use the term reasonably ascertain in the final product, which I can imagine would give them some leniency there.
Representative Bartholomew.
There was some mention the other day of PFAS being added as inert ingredients, which probably wouldn't fall under the definition, the current definition either. It looks like what's being proposed here, that would be covered under triple I. Right? So if it's added, if it does not functional, but it's inert, it's
Yeah.
there, it's added, it still would, this new definition would cover that.
Yeah, if it's
Is that- am I reading
present in the final product, yeah, that's also my
We
understanding.
do have Michael O'Grady, I believe, in the Zoom room. And Michael, if you hear something you want to chime in on, we welcome that.
And I think our intent, at least in supporting this, would be if there is PFAS present in a product, whether it's for the intended use of that product or as a residue of a manufacturing process, such that it could present a health hazard, then it is appropriately subject to regulation.
if it's not intentionally added,
Yeah,
it
well,
just happens to be there by accident.
it's, now, again, we're talking about the intention, the definition of intentionally, but yes.
I'm worried about, we're changing, so it's not, we are subverting the natural dictionary definition of intentional.
So this would be an excellent question for O'Grady. I think Michael Grady. The intent here, I may say,
Subverted
is to be more protective, to make more effective the law, the policies already adopted by the state. You know, is if we've banned PFAS in a product, but it's still there, you know, because of because of the way it is currently defined, that's not really holding true to the spirit, at least, of the law, we would argue.
Does either of you know what a PFAS precursor is?
Yeah, it's a chemical compound that over time, due to chemical process like oxidation, would eventually turn into PFAS. I'm sure your next witnesses could talk more in detail.
Yeah, I think we need to know more about that. Obviously, that's what a precursor is, but I'm saying like what, I'd just be curious what they are.
Could I just say that the state has been running a program, the Chemicals of High Concern to Children's program, for probably around 10 years now. It's a notice program, but it requires manufacturers to provide notice when the chemical is a byproduct of either the manufacturing process or the inputs used in the manufacturing process. So it might not be the intuitive dictionary definition of intentionally added, but you can define it in that way, and you have for at least one other program in the state. I don't know if that's helpful or not. I don't know the answer to the water question. That's a great question, and I think that's a good question for the agency, how they would regulate that for purposes of this definition.
So, so again, this is an area where we've been talking about common ground that we have with the Agency of Natural Resources and others who were involved in producing the recommendations before you. As we move forward to the proposed broader prohibition on PFAS added consumer products, the agency recommends a so-called trigger mechanism that could one day expand the scope of this program to include virtually all PFAS added consumer products. And to be clear, VPIRG supports, agrees that we should move with intention toward the elimination of all unnecessary uses of PFAS. At this moment, other states are moving forward to implement their own policies aimed at addressing the broad use of PFAS in consumer products, including Maine and Minnesota. The witnesses who will follow us immediately can provide more detail to the extent any of you are interested in the progress being made in those states. And certainly it would make sense for Vermont to take stock of what seems to be working or not working there or in any other place that may move forward with programs like that. While we fully agree with the agency that this is the right path to be on, we do have some differences on the finer points of how to get there. We have been engaged in productive, good faith conversations with multiple state agencies on these topics, and we appreciate the opportunity to have those conversations. While we'd like those conversations to continue with hopes that over time we can identify even more common ground. Since we're not there yet, and we do not appear to be on the verge of some combination of other states in the Northeast region with a population of 15 million or more passing this same policy, which would trigger action here under the recommended policy of the agency, we believe that it's sensible to separate out this potential expansion from the rest of the bill. In other words, we encourage you to move forward with the elements of the bill for which there is this broad kind of support with the administration, public health, and environmental advocates. This would mean passing a bill that bans PFAS in dental floss, fluorinated containers, and cleaning products. It would also mean improving that definition of intentionally added in order for the law to be more effective and protective of public health. As you'll see on the next slide, we're looking at states in the Northeast region, and we have the population included for each of those. It's not easy to meet the threshold that would trigger the proposed expansion of our program. New York alone, of course, could do it with a population of more than 15 million. New Jersey and Massachusetts together would make more than 15 million. But if neither New York nor New Jersey acted, it would require every single New England state to come up with a population of 15 million together. I guess, and I should note, Maine has already acted in this area. The point is, we likely have some time before any such trigger would take effect. And so again, we would argue it may make sense to take that part out of this legislation. And we could continue learning from these other states and continue having conversation and dialogue with interested parties in how we could best move forward. Importantly, we believe that it is primarily the potential for the broad expansion of the prohibition of PFAS in consumer products that has encouraged ANR to propose a possible change in the definition of PFAS. We do strongly disagree that any change in definition is necessary, even if there is a broader expansion to consumer products. But it's certainly not necessary if you simply move forward with banning PFAS in dental floss, fluorinated containers, and cleaning products, just as no change in definition was necessary for the bans that are already in place in the state. None of the other states that have passed similar PFAS bans for these products have changed the definition of PFAS as the agency has proposed. The state can and should move forward with these PFAS added product bans without the need for the change in definition for PFAS. So here you have the proposed definition. I guess I would suggest that we're pleased that this committee will be hearing from two scientists from the Natural Resources Defense Council immediately following us. And they have far more in-depth scientific knowledge as to the exact chemistries that are relevant to the change in the PFAS definition. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer questions in more detail. We can provide just a few thoughts in this area, though. The proposed change in definition would allow for the continued use of some harmful classes of PFAS, like HFOs and other F gases. The proposed weakening of the definition could incentivize industry to move towards these other types of PFAS. There's a link in our testimony to a story on Honeywell moving towards using HFOs in personal care products, for instance, and that the regulation of those would be lost if we move toward this definition. If the current definition of PFAS is at some point capturing a product that is unintended, then policymakers such as yourselves could provide an exemption for that particular product or use without weakening the entire definition. Here, we believe it's better to use a scalpel than to create a broad loophole that could weaken the law or create unintended consequences. So again, you'll hear more about that, I think, from the next witnesses. Next, we move to the exemption for recycled products. The agency would like to recommend a path forward for PFAS and recycled products. And while we appreciate the incentive for manufacturers to use more recycled content, we do not believe it would be best for human health to allow for a broad PFAS exemption like this. The proposed change in policy would exempt products containing PFAS that are the products that are made with at least 50% recycled content. It's my understanding that this proposed exemption would also apply to products already regulated that we mentioned earlier by Vermont law, including food packaging, for example. I'm not aware of any other state that has passed PFAS policies that provide an exemption like this for recycled materials. To be clear, VPIRG generally supports policies that cut down on unnecessary waste and promote recycling. I suppose we've done more to promote and advance policies like this than any other organization in the state. But recycling must be done safely, and products derived from recycling must not get a pass when it comes to protecting public health. If a product made of virgin materials, new materials, would be prohibited under the legislation that you're considering here, we think then so too should a product made of recycled materials that also contains PFAS that carries a risk. You just can't give it we would argue you just can't give it a pass in order to promote a recycling goal, much as I like recycling. Okay.
Representative Tagliavia.
In listening to your testimony now and other testimony that we've heard in other days, I can't help but think we're painting ourselves into a corner. You brought up Honeywell moving to another HFOS to get away from PFAS. We've asked numerous questions about alternatives, and I don't believe there actually is one for whatever the actual intended use of PFAS or HFOS is. And I'm wondering, what is the cost to the Vermont economy and ultimately the economy of the whole country if we were to decide tomorrow, no more PFAS? Because some of these regulations that are proposed here could potentially hamstring the Vermont economy, especially if we're the only state that decides to do this in pieces.
Well, here I think we're actually in agreement. We're proposing taking out the part of the law that would potentially expand to broader consumer products at this time. There are a couple of states, at least, that are moving forward in that area, and I think we can learn from them to gain answers to the questions that you raised. These are good questions to ask. What I'm saying is it's not necessary to get there yet if you take out that part of the law for now. Allow these other states to move forward. We take a look at it. We continue the conversations that we're having, and then we come back and reconsider this perhaps next year, perhaps later than that, as opportunities allow. But I'm not really disagreeing with you. I mean, I sometimes laws are technology forcing. You know, they encourage the creation of alternatives. Other states are helping to drive that change now. I think we are in a position of saying, let's move forward with the named product categories where there's broad agreement. Let's take out the part that would potentially broaden it to all consumer products with PFAS at this time. Allow us to have more conversation about that.
I'm just considering, if we would all consider just this morning, from the time we got up to the time we got here to committee, how many things in our lives just today are affected by the inclusion of PFAS, whether intentional or not? And what does it do to our cost of living and our convenience when we're thinking about this broad picture?
I think it's a legitimate question. We did all operate without PFAS not very long ago to accomplish most things in our lives. But
that brings up another question. When were these introduced?
well, right, a lot of these are new, and this is a tremendously growing area where there are somewhere on an order of 14,000 different PFAS chemicals and compounds. The next witnesses would be an excellent folks for you to ask more specific questions along those lines.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So we did the exemption. Now we're talking about pesticides to kind of mostly finish up here. I would say the issue of PFAS in pesticides is very serious, again, very worthy of consideration by this committee and other committees in the building. We do not believe that PFAS in pesticides should be exempt from further consideration. There is developing research finding that PFAS are added to pesticides. A recent report published in the Journal of Environmental Health respects found that 14% of all U.S. pesticide active ingredients are PFAS, including nearly 1/3 of active ingredients approved in the last 10 years. Again, this suggests that there are more and more PFAS being created, and certainly in this area used in pesticides. We're providing, as part of our testimony, a link to a news release just last year that accompanied the release of this study. The study was done by the Environmental Working Group, the Center for Biological Diversity, Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. Together, they published the peer-reviewed study that was the first ever comprehensive review of the ways in which PFAS are introduced into U.S. pesticide products. According to the study, pesticides containing PFAS are used throughout the country on foods such as corn, wheat, kale, spinach, apples, and strawberries. They're also widely used in our homes for insect killing sprays and in flea treatments for pets. As one of the researchers on this project, David Andrews, a PhD, who's the Deputy Director of Investigations and a senior scientist with the Environmental Working Group, put it, quote, PFAS not only endanger agricultural workers and communities, but also jeopardize downstream water sources where pesticide runoff can contaminate drinking supplies. From home gardens to pet care, the use of pesticide products further illustrates why we must end all non-essential uses of persistent forever chemicals, end quote. Now, I do believe that tackling PFAS and pesticides is a more complex issue than at the statewide level than addressing the several product categories that we've been talking about today and that were proposed by ANR in their recommendations. Here too, we believe that more consideration may be needed, but for the reasons mentioned, PFAS and pesticides should not simply be dismissed. In conclusion, we're happy to be in a position to encourage this committee to pass legislation that makes important progress on eliminating the threat of PFAS in some widely used product categories. In this respect, we're in strong agreement with the state agencies who are involved in this process. We also agree with them that improving the definition of intentionally added in the state's existing and proposed regulation of PFAS could make our laws substantially more effective. We urge you to pass these parts of the recommendation while rejecting the proposed change in the PFAS definition and allowing for further consideration of pesticides and then the broad array of consumer products, which they proposed, this trigger mechanism for possibly bringing in. I think you can just put that off for another day as we continue these important conversations with the state agencies and other experts. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you for your testimony. What does allowing for further consideration of pesticides mean to you?
We're now in a world where there was hopes, and out of that study, which you will see, or even the press release from Environmental Working Group, which we included a link to, they provide a number of recommendations. Most of them were aimed at the EPA or other federal agencies. This was done last summer. We now can fairly presume that we're not going to see action at the federal level to address some of these concerns. And so I think attention will come to the states. And it may make sense to say that there should be some coming together of states, that we're not asking Vermont to go alone here. And of course, in none of what we're talking about are we asking that. And even the proposal from the agency, we don't oppose the idea of a trigger mechanism at some point. I think I'd like to be able to find common ground with them on this question of the definition of PFAS. And if we're in agreement there, then we'd be, yes, let's go forward with this idea of a trigger mechanism and broader expansion. And in the meantime, I think you'll hear that we can learn more from Minnesota, from Maine, and perhaps other states who are broadening the scope of their regulation and approach on PFAS. But unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be looking to the federal government for leadership in this area soon.
Do members have any further questions? Thanks again for your testimony.
Thank you.
Our next witnesses are joining via Zoom.
Right.
Katie Pelch.
This is Anna Reed.
Anna, I can't read that far away in the glare.
We're still waiting on.
All right, Anna, are you able to start testimony, or shall we wait for Katie?
Give me 1 second to check on her, and then I can start if she's being held up. Yeah, it looks like she's trying to join right now. It's had a big snowstorm. So
Where are you joining us from?
well, I'm joining you from San Francisco, but she's in Idaho.
Okay. maybe we'll get a ski report at the end of the testimony. Oh.
It looks like she might be a little bit more. I could read her testimony and then mine, and we're both capable of answering the same questions and talking about the same topics, if that's something you wanted to do.
Sure, that'd be great. Kate, would you mind making her portrait? All right, great. We're ready for you to start when you are.
Okay, great. Good morning, members of the committee. Thank you for having us today. So my name is Dr. Anna Reed. I'm a senior scientist for NRDC on the Toxics team, and I'm the director of our PFAS work. We strongly support all action on PFAS, which now constitutes a major global and environmental and public health threat. This is because PFAS are extremely persistent, tend to be highly mobile, and can bioaccumulate or build up in plants, animals, and humans, and have been linked to serious health effects such as cancer, kidney and liver damage, reproductive and immune system harm, and also developmental effects when children are developing. Our continued use of PFAS in consumer and industrial products is likely to impose massive healthcare and cleanup costs. And therefore, we support the agency's proposal to phase out PFAS from additional products that they list in their proposal, building on the protections that Vermont and many other states have already taken on these product categories. The products that the agency is proposing for regulation are products where the use of PFAS has already been deemed unnecessary, either because the function provided by PFAS are not needed or because a safer alternative has been identified. Vermont it's not alone in taking these actions. Thankfully, already 4 other states have banned the use of PFAS in cleaning products. 4 other states have banned the use of PFAS in dental floss, and 7 other states, including Vermont, have banned PFAS in textiles or fabric treatments. And some of those states' laws on textiles include bans on upholstered furniture, so sometimes they're not separated out. It looks like Katie is here. So the magnitude of the PFAS crisis really demands a more efficient approach than one chemical at a time. And we, as scientists, call that the class approach. And that is something that Vermont has already taken. And so we're very supportive of that approach. It's proposing to take that now and has already taken that. And this is an approach that is not just supported by myself and NRDC, but prominent scientists from around the world. It's a approach that has been proposed also to be taken by the EU. However, the proposal the agency has put before you would undercut that approach by weakening the definition of PFAS. That definition that you currently have is a scientific definition that is being used by Vermont and 23 other states. Vermont currently uses the science-based definition of PFAS as chemicals that contain at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. This definition is adapted from a consensus definition that was developed by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And that definition was developed by a group of international scientists representing a variety of stakeholders, which did include scientists from the US EPA, multiple foreign government agencies, the PFAS manufacturers, so scientists that are actually working for the industry, and a lot of independent academic institutions. Importantly, because the use of this definition is supported by over 160 international scientists, the reason why is because the definition focuses on the chemical group or the chemistry that imparts the extreme persistence that is shared by all PFAS. all of the definitions that we know of, including the TSCA reporting definition that the agency is now proposing, exclude PFAS of significant concern. And that creates loopholes that can be exploited by PFAS manufacturers. Unfortunately, the EPA has not yet adopted an agency-wide definition of PFAS. They're using a case-by-case approach, and nor has it provided any justification for why it's specifically excluding different types of chemical structures within the PFAS class.
So we have a question for
Yes.
you, Representative Bartholomew.
Just to be clear, are you saying that the existing definition we have in Vermont is good and you don't recommend we change it?
Yes.
Clear.
So the
Okay.
existing definition of a chemical containing at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom is what Vermont has been using for years, and what 23 other states have been using. It's been used in Congress, and it is based on, is very similar to what's being used internationally and by the EU.
And just another question, when we see the PFAS, every time I should maybe know this, but there's the poly word and there's the per word. What is per? What does that mean?
So perfluoroalkyl substances are, so organic chemistry is basically mostly carbons that are bound to hydrogens. That's the natural occurring chemistry that we're all used to. Those are most of the molecules that are in our bodies, are majority carbon hydrogen chemistry. What has happened with PFAS is that it's a man-made chemistry where they've basically fluorinated those organic molecules and switched out the hydrogens for fluorines. That carbon-fluorine bond is much, much stronger than the carbon-hydrogen bond. That's where the persistence comes in. What the per means is that the entire molecule, wherever there was a hydrogen, has been switched out for fluorinated. So it's fully fluorinated. And that there is a whole separate part of organic chemistry where they have like active groups. That's not what we're talking about, just the carbon hydrogen part of these molecules. The poly is where some of those have been switched out, but not all. And so the thing that we're focusing on, what is the smallest unit that provides that persistence, right? And so that's the one fully fluorinated carbon atom. So it could be a carbon atom with two fluorines that's in the middle of a molecule, because then it's bound to other carbons. That unit won't break apart. If it's at the end of a molecule, it's a carbon with 3 fluorines. And that's why we call it a fully fluorinated carbon atom. So it encompasses the various different versions where carbon atom all of its hydrogens have been switched out for fluorines. That is an easier way to say it than what OECD said. So OECD's definition is more technically correct from a chemistry point of view. It talks about fully fluorinated methyl carbon atoms and methylene carbon atoms. And so what we found is that it tends to be an easier definition from a policy point of view to use one fully fluorinated carbon atom. But again, we also support what OECD did in terms of centering its definition around persistence, and also coming to a consensus with multiple different experts from around the world.
We all set?
Oh, I thought it was an easier question.
That's good.
You're not a chemistry major?
Thank you for that explanation.
Chemistry,
It was
right?
helpful.
Followed some of that.
Yeah, it was very helpful.
Okay. Okay, sorry. So what I was saying earlier was I was talking about the TSCA reporting definition. What we understand about TSCA reporting definition was originally there was a TSCA working definition, which required the presence of 2 adjacent fluorinated carbon atoms. Again, no scientific reason provided as to why that would be more persistent than a single fully fluorinated carbon atom. However, when EPA was developing out its candidate contaminant list 5 for water monitoring, a lot of water agencies were upset with EPA because there were PFAS in their water system that did not fit their definition, and they really wanted EPA support and technical expertise in developing out the ways that they could monitor those PFAS in their water. And so the TSCA reporting definition is basically a response by the EPA of adding additional structures that would incorporate the PFAS that those water agencies wanted to monitor and had already found in their water. And so this is a very piecemeal approach that's being taken by EPA and is really not a comprehensive science-based definition that's being taken, unfortunately. I think Katie is here. If she wants to take over her section, she's much more of an expert on some of these chemicals that we're going to talk about that do not fit the TSCA reporting definition.
Sure, I'm happy to do that, Anna. And I apologize again. I'm so sorry. We had our first big snow and the streets just were not as clear as we had hoped for this morning. So apologies to be late. And thank you for leading for us, Anna. So Anna was just mentioning about the TSCA definition and some of the chemicals that are left out and carved out from this non-scientific and uncomprehensive definition. And one of the chemicals that I'd like to call attention to is the PFAS called trifluoroacetic acid, or TFA. And this is the smallest chemical cousin to the well-known chemical PFOA. So it looks just like PFOA, but it only has 2 carbons instead of 8. So TFA is a PFAS, but it is excluded from the TSCA definition because it does not contain 2 fully fluorinated adjacent carbon atoms. It just has the 1. And unfortunately, TFA's environmental persistence means that it is now not only frequently detected in environmental samples, including drinking water and house dust, but it's also frequently detected in human blood. And in all of these cases, it's often found at higher concentrations than other PFAS that we can monitor for, and more frequently than the other PFAS that we're routinely monitoring for. TFA's very small size also makes it extremely mobile in the environment, so it moves readily from the air to the water. And it makes monitoring for it very challenging, and it is extremely difficult to remediate and clean up. You may have heard about smaller PFAS, for example, in a drinking water context, breaking through your water treatment system more readily. That's because they're smaller, they can slide through the pores of granular activated carbon more easily. And so that holds for TFA because it is very small. So once it's in the environment, it's very hard to clean up. The TSCA definition, Section 8 reporting definition that the agency is now proposing to use is not as characterized in the report, a somewhat narrower definition than the at least 1 fully fluorinated carbon atom definition. And in fact, from a production standpoint, the adoption of the TSCA definition would actually be considered a major narrowing rather than a minor narrowing. And that's because of the specific kind of groups of chemicals that are carved out from it. So the TSCA definition excludes many fluorinated gases that are PFAS, and data from the European Union that's been, really digging into this process of regulating PFAS indicates that applications of fluorinated gases are, by volume, one of the largest use categories of PFAS. The definition also excludes the fluoropolymer PVDF, which has the 2nd largest production volume of all fluoropolymers. And while currently these types of PFAS are not the predominant PFAS used in the product categories that are proposed for restriction there in Vermont, this is not a reason to carve them out of a definition, a science-based definition of PFAS. We also noted that the proposal suggested that the commissioner may add chemicals to the definition of PFAS if the chemical contains at least 1 fully fluorinated carbon atom and is toxicologically similar to chemicals defined as PFAS. But this really reads to me as another example of a piecemeal approach that will be ineffective at protecting public health, and it's not a path that we would recommend going down. Anna, do you want to take back over, or do you want me to continue?
Sure. I'll just cover a few other additional topics that I think I was told was of interest to the committee, and also first start off with a few other reasons why we're concerned about switching to the TSCA reporting definition. Firstly, the agency characterizes the current definition as including many chemistries that do not have the functional qualities of PFAS. So they name persistence, toxicity, and mobility. And that is inaccurate. As I explained before, and as Katie has explained before, the one fully fluorinated carbon atom, or the OECD definition, focuses on what provides persistence. And so by definition, all of the chemicals that would be defined as PFAS under those current scientific definitions are based on the property that provides persistence. So all of those chemistries would be persistent. There might be some PFAS that are more persistent than others, but we are still talking about extreme persistence. Additionally, the gases that Katie had talked about, those are even more mobile than PFOA and PFAS, what we are working with currently. So the legacy PFAS are already highly mobile in our environment. We've seen PFOA and PFAS in the Arctic and in spray foam and rain across the globe, already very highly mobile in our aquatic environment. Now we're making those chemicals smaller, which makes them even more mobile. So that is, we would disagree with that. The final thing about them being toxic or not, the reason why we are supporting a class-based approach, and why I think Vermont originally proposed a class-based approach to source reduction, is that if we were to wait till we had toxicity data on all of the tens of thousands of PFAS possible before we took action, then we would not be able to take action. And so I think, that is not something that we should be focusing on, and it's really also very important in this case with these types of chemistries. We are catching up as scientists to the effects of some of these newer, smaller PFAS. And the absence of toxicity data does not mean the absence of harm. In fact, usually what happens is that we study a chemical, especially in the PFAS class, and we find similar harms. The agency points out that these chemistries have benefits to society in the same sentence that they're talking about them not having these chemical properties. This is not relevant to a scientific definition. We think that considerations of benefits or harms to society really belongs in discussions about policy and policy scope, and should be removed from any discussion of scientific findings, concepts, or definitions. Finally, the agency states that utilizing the TSCA reporting definition will create significant regulatory benefit to be able to use the reporting that is required under the federal law, and that will give Vermont access to significant information regarding the addition of PFAS to products. Unfortunately, that's not the case for multiple different reasons. The first being that the TSCA reporting rule was postponed by the previous administration and until summer of this year. And so it's not actually occurring at the moment. And I would not be surprised, I think a lot of us would not be surprised if that rule goes postponed for significantly longer by the current administration. So I don't know, we don't know when that data will actually be available, when the reporting will actually be required to be started, and then also when we would get that data from the EPA. If the data becomes available, much of it, unfortunately, will also likely be claimed as confidential business information by industry. I shared an analysis. It's a rather old analysis, but we have no reason to believe that the findings would be any different now, where they analyzed all of the data that was reported under TSCA. And what they found was that about half of the information that was reported was claimed as confidential business information, and then, in certain cases, inaccurately so. So that is going to be an issue as well. Additionally, the reporting requirements under TSCA are for chemical manufacturers, and there's no direct connection between the reporting requirements and product manufacturers' supply chain. And in fact, in the later section of the report, when the agency talks about needing to update the intentionally added PFAS definition, which we actually really strongly support, they point out is the responsibility for understanding PFAS use in products should be placed on manufacturers. And in fact, they say, as quote, they're the most knowledgeable about the product suppliers and processes to understand the chemical composition of their products and ultimately whether or not PFAS is present in them. So they are the ones that understand what they're buying in their supply chain and they can ask those suppliers whether or not there's PFAS. The chemical reporting requirements under TSCA are for chemical manufacturers of PFAS. They are guessing what their PFAS are being used for. Hypothetically, even if you could use the TSCA reporting definition as suggested by the agency, it would not provide information on the PFAS chemicals that are exempted by the TSCA reporting definition. So the use of this definition, it is not a minor narrowing of the definition, and it would actually likely allow product manufacturers to continue to use PFAS in the products that you are targeting. So exempting chemicals under scrutiny usually encourages a shift to those exempted chemicals. This has been seen time and time again with PFAS and also with other chemical management in general. So much so that we have a term for it. It's called regrettable substitution. It's when a chemical is banned or restricted or even just comes under scrutiny, it will be replaced by another chemical that we have not restricted or studied, and it generally ends up being just as harmful or potentially worse because it needs to fulfill the same function industrially as the chemical it's being replaced. So the most infamous example within the PFAS class is PFOA and PFOS became under scrutiny, and industry switched to smaller versions of exactly the same molecule. It took decades for science and regulators to catch up. We now know that they are associated with the same harms, and many of them are actually listed by the EPA under the drinking water standards with PFOA and PFOS for having the similar health effects. A similar story could be told for BPA and bisphenols, for halogenated flame retardants. I think if you leave a loophole available, then that is where likely industry will take advantage. And so I think the final thing to think about with this is that when you narrow that definition, you could actually leave Vermont in the dark as to about many PFAS that could be used and because it would no longer even be considered a PFAS and ultimately remove intended protections from Vermont citizens. I have just a few more things, unless there's questions, I can continue.
Do members have questions at this point? I'm not seeing any.
Okay. So the agency's proposed legislation seems to us like it's trying to attempt to solve some theoretical problems that currently do not exist for Vermont. So multiple states have already successfully implemented these restrictions for the use categories that Vermont is proposing to act on using the science-based definition. So we don't understand why there's a need to narrow it. There's really no valid justification that's been provided as to why Vermont needs to weaken its definition and ultimately provide less protections for its citizens compared to those in other states. Neither do any of those states have any exemptions for complex durable goods as an exemption from the consumer products. So it's unclear where complex durable goods are implicated in these categories and what would necessitate the exemption of complex durable goods from that definition in Vermont. We're also a bit concerned about the recycled content exemption. Recycling mandates and efforts really shouldn't excuse the use of toxic chemicals in consumer products and then, the subsequent release of those chemicals into the environment. For example, recycling content really doesn't currently excuse the presence of lead and other heavy metals in consumer products, and we think that the same should apply for PFAS. Additionally, as written, there's no way to distinguish the difference of whether a PFAS is present in a product from recycled content or whether it's been additionally added, and there would be no way to enforce that as well. I think many of these issues could establish problematic precedents, not just for Vermont, but for other states that are working on PFAS that would be very hard to address in the future. And so, as I said before, trying to address problems that could happen in the future when we're not facing them, we would highly discourage. I am pleased though, however, to end with my support of the agency's proposal to restrict PFAS use in cleaning products, dental floss, fluorine-treated containers, and upholstered furniture, because all of these are product categories where PFAS is not needed, and they all currently contribute to increased exposure and risk of harm from PFAS. We're also very supportive of the agency's proposed definition for intentionally added, as I mentioned before. It reflects our current understanding of the many uses and ways PFAS can end up in products. For example, high levels of PFAS have been found in AstroTurf. This is not because it's added directly to the turf, but it's used as a lubricant for extruding those plastic blades. And that has resulted in high levels of contamination across those blades and across AstroTurf. And this is the same for any type of lubricant or plastic molding agent. They are used for those purposes. They will end up on those products. Another example of intentionally added PFAS that has resulted to the intentionally used PFAS in the manufacturing process that has been known to reasonably result in contamination in the final product include cosmetic products and textiles. And then finally, another example of where there's a need to update the definition and clarify it, as the agency has, is fluorinated plastics, which is what it's proposing to add. And plastic can basically coated with PFAS by reacting with fluorine gas. And this is done to make the plastic more durable or prevent leaching. But this definition basically would head off any arguments that PFAS isn't intentionally added to the product, right? Because it is a reaction product. It's not you're actually just adding fluorine gas, you're not adding PFAS, but it is reasonably known to be expected that PFAS is being formed on the surface of the plastic. That is the goal of fluorinating plastics. So that definition of intentionally added, it really is much stronger and clearer and incorporates a lot of PFAS uses that we now know end up contaminating consumer products. And with that, I will end so we have time for questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both for your testimony. I guess I'll kick it off with, can you help us understand the pesticide issue and where other states are in looking at both PFAS in pesticides, but also apparently in the containers that hold them?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My understanding is that PFAS in pesticides come into play in 3 different modes. So PFAS can be used as an actual active ingredient as a pesticide. They can also be added as an inactive or inert ingredient, I think is what they call it, inert ingredient to pesticides. Often that is to help with like dispersal of the pesticide. And then PFAS can leach into pesticides from fluorinated containers. So you're actually, the agency is actually proposing to address that point of that mode of contamination. Many of the states that are working on PFAS and pesticides, well, I'll take that back. Some of the states that I know of that are working on PFAS, the agency that is working on PFAS is like, for instance, in California, it's the Department of Toxic Substance Control. It does not actually have authority over pesticides. So that's a different agency. And so there's been some limitations and there needs to be more cooperation between the two to be able to work out to address the issue. I do know that Minnesota, its Department of Agriculture has put together a list of pesticides that they believe would be considered PFAS, and that is one of the first times that we've had very clear, I think, list of the various different pesticides that would be considered PFAS from an agency. So that's been very helpful. But as you know, their process is probably would not address pesticides until 2032 as part of their full product ban. And it is possible, I think it would be highly likely that pesticide manufacturers would ask for a currently unavoidable use exemption. So then that would depend on whether there are safer alternatives for those pesticides available, which is an interesting area of the currently unavoidable use concept or the essential use concept is, a pesticide is supposed to be harmful. So I'm not sure exactly how that will play out. There has not been a lot of action on PFAS and pesticides across the states so far. Katie, do you remember if I think Maine and Maryland have looked into PFAS and pesticides as well?
Yes, they both have, but it's not an area that I've been actively tracking and engaged in. Sorry.
You know who has been?
Yeah.
Yeah, I could get the contact for the organization that's been really involved in Maryland for sure. It'll take me just a second to look that up though.
Okay, you can send that in afterwards.
Okay.
I actually see Ella has her hand up. I'll go to Ella and then to, to Representative Chapin and then to Representative Bartholomew.
Thanks so much for your presentation. This is Representative Ella Chapin. I'm also on Zoom. I'm sick today. It's really helpful to have your national level perspective. I'm wondering if you could comment on the 15 million population threshold for the Northeast, and if, like, nationally, is that important for the Northeast states to wait until they have that kind of a threshold reached? Is it more relevant for certain products than others? If you could comment on that, that'd be great.
Right. I don't think a threshold matters when you're doing what Vermont's currently proposing to do, which is to restrict uses where there is already an established reason for the PFAS to not be needed. So if other states are already doing it, there's a report showing that there's lots of alternatives available. Or you've decided that PFAS use in those product categories is not justified. But I think what you're speaking to is the trigger mechanism for a more comprehensive product ban like Maine and Minnesota or the EU was attempting to do. I think the thing that we have stressed, and actually, so I've spent a lot of time with other scientists developing out the essential use concept. We wrote a paper on all the different aspects of the concept that we thought were most important to keep and to apply in terms of implementing it in the US and Canada recently. Excuse me. I'm also fighting what you're fighting. One of the things is having an agency capable of making those determinations from a resource point of view. If you're going to do an essential use or comprehensive ban where you do provide time exemptions for currently unavoidable uses, you will receive a lot of petitions for an extension or exemption from that ban. And so having an agency that is able to handle that volume and to be able to pull on the resources it needs to be able to understand whether or not a petition is valid and it meets all the criteria for an essential use or a currently unavoidable use is, I think, the most important factor when a state is considering whether or not they want to do this. If you just don't have the manpower to handle it, it could establish bad precedents. It could also just be more ineffective than tackling groups of PFAS categories, product categories at a time, as because this isn't a state by state effort. This is everybody's working together towards solving this issue as quickly as possible. And that's what we've seen. I think actually did not have time to submit a lot of resources that I thought you might find interesting. I can actually show you a chart, I believe, of all of the action that's been happening across the states. If you give, I'll work on that in a second. But I think what you're seeing in Minnesota is an agency that has been able to meet kind of all the different timelines for establishing regulations that it needs to do to be able to do both the reporting and eventually the currently unavoidable use petitions and designations. And so I think that's something that to think about. It's not necessarily the population, but what is the agency that is responsible for implementing the idea capable of doing. And I think that, oh, thank you, Katie. So this is a compilation of all the different states that have worked on PFAS, the year that the product categories ban goes into effect. And as you can see, there's been a lot of work on various different product categories across the states. Vermont is doing a fantastic job, as you can see. But it's not alone. And I think that is something to consider in making that decision. Is really it's about resources and the ability to do it correctly.
Great, thank you. Can you make that website link available to our committee?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Representative Bartholomew.
I'm finding myself confused about the, when we talk about PFAS chemicals as active ingredients in pesticides. Because I know about organophosphates, neonicotinoids, warfarin, there are Bacillus thuringiensis. There's so many pesticides. Are some of those PFAS chemicals and I didn't know it, or is this a different class of pesticide?
I believe actually, from my understanding, is that a small portion of the active ingredient is being fluorinated to increase its persistence in the environment so that the pesticide lasts longer. It's not about, the fluorination is not added. Again, I'm not developing pesticides, but it's not being added for the actual active function. It is to make the pesticide last longer in the environment. Does that make sense? So you could have the traditional pesticides you're thinking of, but what could be occurring is that you could add polyfluorinated carbon atom into part of the structure. And that helps.
So the chemical structure of an organophosphate might be changed to a PFAS chemical, so it's still an organophosphate and also a PFAS.
Yes. So you can, yeah, you would be both. Is a possibility. I think there is a chart or table of pesticides that Minnesota found that we could share with. Oh, Katie is in the background adding them to the chat.
I was gonna say there's some common chemicals that you might have heard on there, things like bifenthrin, fipronil. I'm not a pesticide expert, so yeah, as Anna was saying, it's because the carbon fluorine moiety or chemical group is so persistent, it's added to these chemicals to make them last longer in the environment and to ensure that, if they're lasting longer, then they're having the rest of the activity that you want that chemical to have. So it's not a separate class like neonics. It's an added kind of chemical decoration, if you will, to make that chemical last longer.
Members have further questions? Representative North.
Yeah, I do have a question. So it seems what we are promoting here is the simpler definition, which is just any molecule with at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom, regardless of where it exists in the chain.
Yes.
that that's the definition we're pursuing and that we want to ultimately ban anything that contains any such molecule.
Mhm.
So my
Well-
understanding from, okay, is my understanding correct? That that's the direction we're heading?
What my understanding is within the product categories that have been identified. Yeah. Mhm.
Right. So so is that essentially taking the approach that everything is guilty until proven innocent? Right?
Yeah, so that's the class-based approach, right? So it's not quite that simple, but yes, you could think of it that way. The class-based approach does actually have quite a bit of scientific reasoning and underpinnings, but from kind of more of a policy point of view, you are seeing time after time chemicals that, from a public health and chemical expert point of view, what we see is time and time again there are chemicals that we see with certain hazard characteristics, persistence, mobility, certain types of biological activity, and we know that before we can do large human studies or even long-term animal studies, right? And so we see these early warnings, and then we are not allowed to act and protect people until it's already harmed people. The proof, I guess, is what you would call it, right? And so the class-based approach is saying all PFAS have multiple different hazard characteristics. They are very highly likely to be a problem for us in the future, even if we can't prove that they're a problem for us right now. So from a policy point of view, you're saying it is not worth the risk, knowing all of the facts that we know about this class of chemicals. When you say hazard characteristics, all PFAS are extremely persistent. So if we produce them now, we will be dealing with them 100 years from now, regardless of whether or not we have toxicity data on them now or later. Most PFAS, not all, are highly mobile, so we cannot contain them once we produce them. They end up, contaminating our environment in ways that we will not be able to ever clean up. Once they're in our food web, we cannot. There's no way to remove PFAS from a plant. Then the other characteristic is bioaccumulation. Not all of them, but a lot of them bioaccumulate in our bodies. So they build up at higher levels in our bodies than the outside environment. That's because they're not natural chemistries. They are man-made chemistries. So there's no mechanism in our body that has naturally been developed to eliminate them well. And then finally, the toxicity part, that's what everybody is concerned about, right? Is what is it doing to my body? Every PFAS that has been well studied has been linked to health harms. We cannot study every single PFAS in this class in a timely manner. And so that is the question for you as a policy expert, is making that decision. Do we need to wait to study every single chemical in that class in order to act? If we don't take a class-based approach, what will happen is that industry will continue to switch to PFAS that are not regulated. And we will continue to try and study that, but they're often not required to share what they've changed to. So we are back engineering what we find in the environment. That takes years. Once we figure out what that new chemistry is that they've been using for probably a decade, then we have to start studying it. How does it interact in the environment? How is it getting into our bodies? How is it affecting our health? And that also takes decades. And so then we have to build up that mass of information and bring it to you all and say, this is a problem. So that is why we are so strongly supportive of the class-based approach. PFAS is the biggest example of the need for a class-based approach, but we've taken that in other situations as well, with like dioxins and furans and with PCBs, where you see kind of a group of chemicals that are related, and it's not a stretch to assume that they're going to have similar effects in our body or in the environment.
So then does that ultimately put us in a position where we've banned it all, but if we do find, if through technological advances that there are certain PFAS structures that are not toxic and are beneficial, whether like in pharmaceuticals. I thought we heard some testimony earlier that there are PFAS chemicals in pharmaceuticals, and that's actually a necessary part of the pharmaceutical to get the function out of it. So do we then have to individually identify this one is okay, and you got to get like permits or something for individual PFASs to operate in certain realms, or that puts us in a permitting mode then, I guess?
So pharmaceuticals are interesting. They've gone through a lot of testing to get to be able to be used as a drug on humans. But nobody's studied the long-term effect of that. But I think what we're thinking about from a public health point of view is that the benefits of those pharmaceuticals outweigh the potential harms, right? So that is a different kind of approach to it. And we are not proposing to regulate pharmaceuticals within the like consumer product category, right? I think again, this is where we come to the essential use approach, where we're talking about not using these chemicals unless we absolutely have to, right? So I guess you're talking about a permitting approach in terms of like when we're talking about the essential use approach, if you don't need to use these chemicals, they already have enough health and environmental concerns associated with them. You shouldn't use them. If you do need to use them because there's no safer alternative, it's critical for health, safety, and functioning of society, and you actually need it for the functioning of your product, all of those things combined. If that's the case, then the proposal is to continue to let you use them. We don't want to shut down, essential things for the functioning of society or health and safety. So, pharmaceuticals would fit into the health and safety part of those exemptions. Then you should continue to be able to use them. And so it's a balancing of trying to reduce the harms of these chemicals and still allowing society to function as we need it to function. But, it also would encourage the market to start developing alternatives to PFAS more quickly. If a PFAS was studied to the extent it needs to be studied and not shown to have the health effects that we know are associated with PFAS, we would be happy to talk about whether or not, what to do at that point. But again, that we have not seen that in any case.
Very expensive.
If I can add on that a little bit from a different kind of chemical group perspective. My background in graduate school was studying a group of chemicals called bisphenols. You might have heard of BPA. It's what makes polycarbonate plastic. It's also on the coating of thermal receipt paper. And so we know from mountains and mountains of evidence that bisphenol A is an endocrine disrupting chemical. It mimics our body's normal estrogen. It can bind to the estrogen receptor and block estrogen activity. It can disrupt other hormone signals as well. And so just like for PFAS, there was this like toxic treadmill of regrettable substitution. As scientists caught up to the fact that bisphenol A and started raising the alarm that bisphenol A was harmful, additional bisphenol chemicals were used as drop-in replacements. They look very similar, but they also impact our body and disrupt our body's hormone systems in a similar way to bisphenol A. So there was a chemical manufacturer who was really interested in still preserving some of the useful properties of this group of chemicals, and they designed a different bisphenol. And they came to the scientific community and they said, and also at this time, there aren't like sweeping regulations on bisphenol A. There was a phase out, there's a regulation on bisphenol A in baby products and baby bottles, but by and large, there's not an economy-wide ban on bisphenols. But this manufacturer said, well, tell us what tests we need to do, because the regulatory agencies are not requiring us to do the test that you are saying show how harmful this chemical truly is. The regulatory agencies, in other words, are falling flat. They're not keeping up with the pace of independent academic scientific advances to know that these chemicals truly are harmful. The required tests just aren't meant to pick up these really sensitive and important health outcomes And so the chemical agency came to the academic scientists and said, what test would you like to see for us to show you that this chemical is less harmful? It's not completely without any harms, but that it is less harmful than what's currently on the market. And I think through that process, my understanding is that there were, I believe it was the state of Washington, had some regulations on bisphenol A at least. I can't remember if it was just bisphenol A or the whole class, but so they said, well, in these particular uses, because you've done the work that we would have liked you have done, we will allow for this new chemical to be used in place of bisphenol A. So it kind of turned the situation on the head. I mean, on its head of, instead of independent academic scientists being a decade behind in detecting and showing the harm of the chemical, the responsible manufacturer of the chemical said, okay, I'll do the work up front, and then we can see if this chemical can be used.
Representative Tagliavia.
I think this question is for Anna. You brought up something about the level of testing that's necessary to find out, I guess, the harmful effects. Are we talking about the number of people or in a study, or a number of years in a study, or both?
It's more about the fact that PFAS so far tend to be systemic toxicants in that they don't target one thing. So like with BPA, we know the main target is hormone disruption. With PFAS, they increase our risk of cancer. They cause liver and kidney damage. They increase our risk of developmental harms, low birth weight, suppress our immune system, cause infertility. That's a lot of different health effects that we now have found to be associated with exposure to PFAS. And the key thing is that each individual PFAS often have 5, 6, 7 of those health harms associated with it. And so what we're talking about is breadth of coverage in terms of toxicity. The current health studies that are provided by chemical industries usually are very narrow, and they are not designed to pick up these types of health effects. So a good example is developmental effects, right? That would require you to expose an animal to the chemical while it was pregnant, possibly, or even before, and then follow out the development of its offspring, also expose the offspring, right? This is what would happen in real life, and see what happens to development. That is not something that is required traditionally before you can put a chemical on the market. Usually what we see are some bacterial mutagenesis studies. That's whether or not the bacteria's DNA gets disrupted, and then they say it's safe. But they haven't looked at all of these effects that I've told you are associated with PFAS exposure. And so what Katie was talking about is that the scientific community has a much more nuanced and advanced understanding of the ways these chemicals that we're exposed to can affect our health long term. And a lot of the old school toxicity studies that are being required are used reflect an understanding of a long time ago. They look for, is there a large tumor I can see on an organ, right? Is there mortality within a certain amount of time? And that is good that those effects don't happen before or are looked for before a chemical goes on the market, but it is not at all protective of these types of chemicals that we're concerned about that work over a long period of time. It's similar to like smoking. It took a long time for us to understand just how harmful smoking was, and then a very long time for I think the scientific and public health community to convince everybody else that yes, you are not keeling over from smoking cigarettes right away. but you are increasing your risk of lung cancer and other harmful health effects over a long period of time. And you're not guaranteed, if you smoke a pack of cigarettes every day, to die from lung cancer, but you are much more likely to do so, right? So it's an increased risk of these harms. Everybody is different, unfortunately, and so people's biology is a little bit different, that reacts a little bit differently. But I think overall, from a public health point of view, we don't want to be seeing large increases in risk of all these different health effects. Does that help answer your question?
A little bit. I just,
Okay.
we're using these words like associated with and correlation versus causation. And one of the other terms that I've heard in testimony was ubiquitous.
Mhm.
Just playing devil's advocate. Nitrogen is ubiquitous in our atmosphere. If I come down with cancer, is it okay for the doctor to tell me that nitrogen in the atmosphere caused my cancer because it's ubiquitous?
Well, there's no studies that have looked at that to support that. So there are multiple forms of evidence that allows us to make these conclusions. One is with animals, we can say they do cause these effects because we can do controlled experiments where you have animals that aren't exposed to these chemicals, and then you have animals that are exposed to increasing levels of exposure to these chemicals. And so in that case where you have a controlled experiment, we can say they do cause cancer, they do cause low birth weight, they do cause liver effects. Okay. Again, that doesn't allow us to say they do cause these effects in humans because animals and humans were related, but we're not exactly the same, right? So then there's other forms of evidence. So where we study in humans effects, right? And so that's, I think, what you're talking about. There are lots of ways in which we can control for confounders. And I don't know, maybe Katie wants to talk about this a little bit more than I do. But the idea is that we've found lots of ways to make sure that you are controlling for the thing you're trying to look at in the human population. And it is hard to do. And that is why often, just because one human study has found an effect does not mean that we all say that is 100% true. What we look to see is multiple studies finding the same conclusions. So with PFAS, you see like effects on the ability to lactate in 5 out of 6 human studies. That makes us a lot more confident that that is the case. I don't know, Katie, you want to add to that?
Sure. Yes, and there's not just a single study, as Anna was saying, right? There's a growing body of evidence. So you're looking at what scientists do and what agencies like EPA's Integrated Risk Information System, the IRIS agency, do, is they really try to take the whole body of evidence, like what is all of the science that we have available today telling us? So they are looking at the human epidemiological studies. They are looking at the animal toxicological studies. They're looking for where they're inconsistent as well, because that tells us something about maybe the difference in biology between a rat and a mouse, or a mouse and a human, or this human population and a different human population, and why one group might be more susceptible to a risk than another group. So I think that there's that evidence. And so one of the questions earlier was like, well, what is the timeline? How long does this take? That takes decades, years to decades. There's actually empirical evidence to show that when one chemical, like bisphenol A, for example, is phased out and comes under scrutiny, we can see that there's a very long lag between the amount of time that scientists understand what the replacement is and how harmful it is. And that's not even getting to the regulatory standpoint, but just that the need for that body of evidence to catch up and grow, to show what those harms might be. The other question that you raised about is ubiquitous. And that just means that these chemicals are everywhere. So that's more of a discussion. That's a whole different type of science to look at exposure versus harm. And so we know that, we're curious about PFAS chemicals because they're so persistent and so mobile in the environment. So scientists with different expertise go out and they will measure them in surface water, in groundwater, in drinking water, in soil, in sludge, in the air, in the house dust. So they're looking across all different types of environmental matrices. And it's the compilation of all that evidence of all those different types of scientists working together that gives us the confidence to say that these are ubiquitous chemicals because they are detected across different types and places of our environment. So that's a little bit of a separate conversation than the health harms.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It was very edifying, and you took us back to our roots of high school chemistry in some moments. Thanks for that. I'm curious if anyone else heard the story this morning. I heard it on public radio about the polar bears and their waterproofness, and another lesson we can learn from nature where there's hope that we could replace some of the qualities and benefits of PFAS chemicals by looking at polar bear, the oil on their fur. And another public service announcement, which is that we are starting at 1:15 today. So you have a little extra time for lunch, and I hope you can be on time for a start at 1:15.